Αλλά ας επανέλθουμε στο θέμα αυτό, να καλωσορίσουμε τον καθηγητή κύριο Gotzsche.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ κύριε Γιαννουλόπουλε. Δύο σύντομα βιογραφικά στοιχεία για τον Dr. Peter Gotzsche, ο οποίος είναι Δανός γιατρός, ιατρικός ερευνητής. Έχει μεταπτυχιακό στη βιολογία και τη χημεία. Το 1975 ανέλαβε στη φαρμακευτική βιομηχανία ως εκπρόσωπος φαρμάκων από την Astra AB. Το 1977 πήρε θέση στην Astra Syndex και ήταν υπεύθυνος για κλινικές δοκιμές. Και φτάνουμε σύντομα στο 2019, όταν ίδρυσε ένα νέο Ινστιτούτο για την Επιστημονική Ελευθερία, του οποίου στόχος είναι η διατήρηση της τιμιότητας και της ακεραιότητας στην επιστήμη. Σε αυτό το συνέδριο θα μας αναλύσει τις παράπλευρες ζημίες από τον φόβο και τον πανικό που διεσπάρει στην κοινωνία, κατά πόσο τα εμβόλια είναι ασφαλή και αποτελεσματικά, καθώς και την εμπειρία μας από τα εμβόλια γενικότερα. Dr. Peter Gotzsche, welcome.
Thank you. I described this epidemic early on as an epidemic of panic more than anything else. And I am used to working with infectious diseases. There was very little science. It was almost all about politics. And part of the explanation for the panic is that no one will get in trouble for measures that are too draconian, only if it can be argued that what they did was too little. And it also gives power to those at the top to make these recommendations.
Can you please go ahead a little? The recommendations were made by whom?
Politicians at the top and the National Board of Health. They gain more power by all their interventions. And the whole focus has been on coronavirus, as if we can no longer die from other diseases. But the closing down of countries have had great consequences. For example, people with heart attacks and blood clots in their brains have been afraid of going to the hospital, which increases their risk of dying. I have missed the science. Why did no country close only half of the schools and then saw what happened? Why did no country randomize half of the schools to close and the other half to stay open? Because then we would have learned if it was a good or a bad idea to close schools. And when you send children home, who should look after them when their parents go to work? That could be their grandparents. And this could be a disaster because those who die from corona, they are more than 80 years old. I shall mention some of the foolish interventions. In Denmark, we closed our borders to Germany and Sweden, even though we had more coronavirus than they had. They might as well have closed the biggest island in Denmark and then called for the military to guard the bridges so no one could pass. In Denmark, we closed the golf courses, but you were allowed to work there, to walk there, if only you did not look like a golfer. You understand?
What do you mean golf?
Playing golf.
So they did close the golf terrains, or
they closed the golf courses, but only if you played golf. If you just took a walk on the golf course, this was allowed. In March, our government had a plan of allowing only 2 people together at a time.
You mean outside?
Gatherings of more than 2 people. They wanted to forbid this. So I joked with my wife that 2 persons in a double bed was no longer allowed by our prime minister. And we were going to Spain on holiday. This was not possible. Then we wanted to go to Cyprus, but then they wanted everybody to be tested in order to leave Denmark, even though we have very little coronavirus. This is crazy.
It is Cyprus and Spain who wanted the Danish people.
Cyprus. We could not go on vacation in Cyprus without having been tested for coronavirus.
Hmm.
The WHO contributed to the panic because they said the virus was very deadly and very contagious, and none of this is true. So then you can ask, why do so many die when it's not more dangerous than influenza?
Why so many people die, although it's not more contagious than influenza, you say?
It's not more contagious and not more dangerous than influenza. I think there are 2 main reasons. The infectious dose is very important. The greater the dose, the greater the chance of dying.
Infectious dose of what?
Of the virus.
Ωραία. Οπότε η δόση μόλυνση εξαρτάται και από την μολυσματική δόση. Όσο μεγαλύτερη είναι η μολυσματική δόση, τόσο μεγαλύτερη πιθανότητα έχει κανείς να πεθάνει.
A Danish researcher found out that secondary cases of measles in the household have 3 to 4 times greater mortality than the one who got infected in the first place.
You mean, can you please repeat of measles? What do you mean?
Ilara.
If you send a person home with measles,
Yes.
in order not to infect others, okay?
Yes.
Then the persons in the household have 3 to 4 times greater risk of dying than the person you sent home. This is because people at home get a higher dose of the virus than if you infect someone out in society.
Γιατί στο σπίτι, όντας στο σπίτι, παίρνεις, παραμένοντας δηλαδή στο σπίτι τόσες ώρες με τους άλλους, παίρνεις πολύ περισσότερη δόση του κορονοϊού από ότι το να είσαι έξω.
Therefore, it is not a good idea to isolate people in their home. It is better to isolate them in quarantine centers. Now, if we want to save lives, we use far too much money on the corona epidemic. It is far too expensive to avoid 1 death from coronavirus compared to other things we could do. People are now dying in Africa and elsewhere because they cannot get treatment for malaria and tuberculosis because of the corona hysteria. We could save many more lives much cheaper if we fought against tobacco, for example. And then we have the face masks. It seems that they might have an effect, but the effect is very small if you ask every citizen to have a face mask. It has been estimated that 200,000 people in Norway need to have a face mask in order to prevent just 1 virus infection in a week. So if you want to use face masks, it should be used by healthcare personnel to reduce the risk of getting infected. This is what the WHO recommends, to say that the whole population should wear face masks. No, I believe this is going much too far. Now, part of the panic is because when you watch TV, you only see the number of new infected people. So why do we not on TV see the number of newly infected people divided by the number of tests? Now there is big panic in Denmark, although virtually no one dies from coronavirus. We test more than any other country in the world, and therefore we find more virus that doesn't matter. The number of hospital admissions for coronavirus has changed very little, but still the government is panicking. So now we are told for the first time in Danish history that we cannot go to a restaurant without face masks. Let's change to another subject, the vaccines. There is a lot of optimism, but if you look at the history of vaccines against coronavirus and also influenza, there is not a good basis for this optimism. It has been tried to develop a coronavirus for 30 years, and people have not succeeded. And if you compare with influenza vaccines, then it has never been shown that they protect against infecting others, that they protect against hospital admission, that they protect against lung diseases, or that they protect against death. In contrast, we have highly effective vaccines, for example, against measles, smallpox, polio, that has saved millions of lives. So now it seems that coronavirus vaccines will be fast-tracked. This means that we will know much too little about the harms. And the European Union wants to give the companies legal immunity so that they will not be responsible for vaccine harms. I think this is a disaster because drug companies already function like organized crime. So this is just stupid, and there are people who try to prevent this from happening. Talking about vaccines, there is a Danish researcher that has shown that vaccines against measles, polio, and tuberculosis lower death from other infections. He has shown that live attenuated vaccines seem to have this effect. He has also shown that if you give vaccines that consist of dead microorganisms, these vaccines seem to increase total mortality in Africa, for example. We do not know why this is the case, but Canadian researchers have shown that when you vaccinate against influenza, you increase your risk of getting infected next year with other influenza strains. So we can use these results positively. because we can do trials with measles vaccine, even if people had it as a child, with polio vaccine, with Bacille Calmette-Guerin, the TB vaccination, and then see what happens. There is already a trial ongoing in Holland. It is, the immune system is incredibly complicated, and we do not know why vaccines interact this way. But my colleagues' findings are really convincing to me. Earlier this year, I published a book about vaccines and also wrote about the corona epidemic. I argued why I consider it ethically wrong to have mandatory vaccinations. You have a proud tradition in Greece. Hippocrates is one of them. First, do no harm.
Και μέσα στο βιβλίο έγραψα επιχειρήματα εναντίον του υποχρεωτικού εμβολιασμού. Εσείς οι Έλληνες πρώτοι έχετε τις αρχές που έθεσε ο Ιπποκράτης σχετικά με την ιατρική και η πρώτη αρχή είναι το να μην βλάψεις. Να μην βλάψεις
very few people are against all vaccinations, but rather than demanding that their children should get measles vaccinated, I believe in dialogue with them. In California, they now want to make it mandatory for all students and all staff at their universities to get vaccinated against influenza. The argument is that if there is less influenza, they will have enough hospital beds for coronavirus. This is totally irresponsible. First, influenza vaccine does not reduce the use of hospital beds. This has never been documented. Second, they have plenty of hospital beds in California. Third, there are harms of influenza vaccines, and they can sometimes be severe. Fourth, mandatory flu shots are very likely to increase resistance against all vaccines. I have helped a lawyer in California to bring this to court in order to prevent this foolish idea. And then a little about how naive our politicians are. There are public-private collaboration about development of a corona vaccine. One of my colleagues has spent more than a month trying to get access to the protocols to see what goes on. We have no idea if a successful vaccine will be so expensive that people in many countries cannot afford it. We don't even know if independent scientists can get access to the data and judge the data for themselves. But previous cases with the drug industry has shown that when you get access to all the data, it looks very different from what the companies have published. So we suspect that European politicians have just given away public money to big companies without ensuring that everything will be transparent and can be checked by others. This is very strange because we have had the Tamiflu scandal. European governments, they bought Tamiflu for billions and billions. And Roche, the Swiss drug company, claimed that Tamiflu had a lot of positive effects like decreasing hospital admission, decreasing pneumonia, and such things that were simply not true. The British Medical Journal helped one of my colleagues put so much pressure on Roche. It took several years that finally they gave him the trial data. So what we know today about Tamiflu and Relenza is that they have an effect on par with paracetamol, a painkiller. There is no good reason to use these expensive drugs. So I have described in one of my books that Roche might have committed the biggest theft in European history. So this is why we must hold the politicians in Europe responsible for what they do with the vaccines. So one of my colleagues who was elected for Spain to the European Parliament some years ago, he has sent a protest to the European Ministers of Health, the European Commission, and so on, that many of us have signed. So I have tried to accommodate the translation, so I have skipped some of what I tried to say, but I would also like to have just a little time before you go on if you have questions.
Άλλαξα λίγο την ομιλία μου, την συντόμευσα, για να δώσω χρόνο και για να γίνει και η μετάφραση. Δεν ξέρω αν μπορείτε να μου δώσετε λίγο περισσότερο χρόνο και να απαντήσω και σε ερωτήσεις.
Ναι.
Έχετε κάποιες ερωτήσεις, κύριε Γιαννουλόπουλε?
Ναι, βεβαίως, να δώσουμε περισσότερο χρόνο και θέλουμε να ρωτήσουμε πάρα πολλά πράγματα τον κύριο Γκότσε, γιατί δεν είναι εύκολο και να έχει την τύχη κανείς να τον έχει στη διάθεσή του όπως σήμερα και τον ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ.
Κύριε Γιαννουλόπουλε, μπορείτε να προχωρήσετε στις ερωτήσεις?
Βεβαίως. Μπορώ να μιλήσω?
Ναι, βεβαίως.
Να καλωσορίσουμε τον κύριο Γκότσε στην παρέα μας σήμερα και να τον ευχαριστήσουμε για όλες αυτές τις επιστημονικές πληροφορίες του και όπως γνωρίζει, τον έχουμε καλέσει να έρθει στην Ελλάδα να τον δούμε από κοντά και να μιλήσουμε περισσότερο. Είναι ανοιχτή η πρόσκληση.
Thank you so much.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ.
Να αρχίσουμε τη συζήτηση που, όπως έχουμε πει, κύριε Γκότσε, εμείς εδώ, ότι μετά από κάθε ομιλία είναι το σπουδαιότερο πράγμα, είναι η πεμπτουσία της κάθε ομιλίας.
Συγγνώμη, δεν κατάλαβα. Τι είναι η πεμπτουσία?
Ότι το σημαντικότερο κομμάτι της ομιλίας είναι η συζήτηση και ο διάλογος.
The most important part of a presentation, of a speech, is the part that there is interaction and dialogue.
Yeah.
Και η πρώτη ερώτηση που θα έθετα είναι: υπάρχει πράγματι ανάγκη εμβολιασμού για τον COVID-19, αν λάβουμε υπόψη ότι στην Ιταλία, σε μια απομονωμένη περιοχή, την οποία έκανε ο καθηγητής Πασκουάλε Μπάκο, μελετώντας 7.038 άτομα, τα οποία δεν βρισκόντουσαν στο θέατρο της επιδημίας, ήταν πολύ απομονωμένα, μακριά, και έκανε το τεστ αντισωμάτων και βρέθηκε ότι ο πληθυσμός που είχε κατά 49% βρέθηκαν αντισώματα έναντι του κορονοϊού χωρίς να έχουν κανένα σύμπτωμα. Και αυτή η μελέτη έγινε περίπου τον Απρίλιο μήνα, οπότε αν κάνουμε τώρα τεστ αντισωμάτων, υποθέτουν στην Ιταλία οι ερευνητές ότι θα ανιχνευτούν αντισώματα σε πολύ μεγαλύτερο ποσοστό στον πληθυσμό.
Well, I have not seen this research, and I have a few comments. First of all, we need to know if these antibodies, how often they are false positive, because there are many different coronaviruses. Because they might have antibodies not against COVID-19, but something similar. Now, the other thing I would say is that the coronavirus is killing a lot of people. So if we could have an effective vaccine with not too many harms and which was not too expensive, then it could be a very good idea, of course.
Εάν λάβουμε υπόψη μας όμως ότι ο κορονοϊός και όλη η οικογένεια των κορονοϊών έχουν την ιδιότητα να μεταλλάσσονται πολύ συχνά, πώς μπορούμε να είμαστε σίγουροι ότι μπορούμε να έχουμε εμβόλιο? Μήπως αυτή η σκέψη μοιάζει με το λεγόμενο το επικείμενο εμβόλιο του AIDS που το περιμένουμε 30 έως κορονοϊού?
Well, yeah, and you can also look at influenza vaccines. That these influenza viruses, they change a lot. I don't think we know how often this corona-19 changes, but all viruses change. So even if we find a good vaccine, it might not be so effective a year later. We do not know this yet. So the most important thing is, of course, hygiene. And that also protects against influenza and a lot of other things.
Και τέλος, αν βάλουμε στη ζυγαριά, σύμφωνα με τον Ιπποκράτη που είπε ο κύριος Γκότσε, «Οφελέιν μη βλάπτην», πώς κρίνει ο καθηγητής ότι ο εμβολιασμός θα ωφελήσει περισσότερο ή θα έχουμε περισσότερα προβλήματα από τις παρενέργειές του?
That's very true. I fear that a new vaccine will get approved with much too little known about it, because everybody is hysterical. Yeah.
Και μία ίσως τελευταία ερώτηση. Γνωρίζετε φυσικά τον κώδικα της Νιρεβέργης για τους γιατρούς που συντάχθηκε μετά τη δίκη των γιατρών στη Νιρεβέργη, που λέει ότι ο ασθενής πρέπει να ενημερώνεται για αν πρόκειται να εμβολιαστεί, δηλαδή το παλαιότερο που λέγαμε στα λατινικά το habeas corpus. Αυτό με τον υποχρεωτικό εμβολιασμό, κατά τη γνώμη σας, καταστρατηγείται?
This is a horrible thought that you should vaccinate people without their informed consent. This has been done in the Philippines, where children were vaccinated against dengue virus without the parents' consent. And some children died. So there was a huge scandal, and there was corruption in the Ministry of Health. There was corruption at the Prime Minister level. It was an enormous scandal. We must ensure that no such thing ever happens in Europe. Let me say that we already have these fascism tendencies in Europe and in the United States, where you can be fired if you work in a hospital and don't want the flu shot.
Είναι γεγονός ότι...
Να ευχαριστήσουμε θερμά τον κύριο Gotzsche και εσάς, κύριε Γιαννουλόπουλε.
Θέλω να κάνω μια ερώτηση.
Μια ερώτηση ο καθένας ακόμα, κύριε Παπαμιχαήλ.
Μια τελευταία σας παρακαλώ, γιατί ο χρόνος μας πιέζει πάρα πολύ. Βγαίνουμε εκτός προγράμματος.
Πρώτα και μετά εγώ.
Ονομάζομαι Παπαμεθοδίου Δημοσθένης, είμαι νευρολόγος. Είναι μεγάλη τιμή που έχουμε εδώ έναν καθηγητή τέτοιου διαμετρήματος στο συνέδριό μας. Το βιβλίο του για τα φάρμακα ήταν μια αποκάλυψη για μένα και το έκανα και δώρο σε πολλούς συναδέλφους γιατρούς για να μπορέσουν να ενημερωθούν.
And I gave it as a present to many colleagues, other doctors, so that they would become informed.
You know it exists in Greek?
Yes, many years. There are many years here. I have to... Θέλω να σας κάνω μια ερώτηση. Αν θα πρέπει να νιώθουμε πιο ασφαλείς μετά από την ανακοίνωση που κάνανε οι 9 μεγαλύτερες εταιρείες που παρασκευάζουν εμβόλια, ότι θα ακολουθήσουν όλους τους κανόνες του FDA για την παραγωγή των εμβολίων, για τον SARS, για τον COVID.
That is very interesting.
Αυτό είναι πολύ ενδιαφέρον.
When the criminals ask for more law and order, you should be suspicious.
Όταν οι εγκληματίες ζητάνε περισσότερο νόμο και τάξη, θα πρέπει να είσαι πιο καχύποπτος.
I shall explain why.
Τώρα θα εξηγήσω γιατί.
Yeah, we have discussed this on some email lists.
Έχουμε συζητήσει αυτό σε μερικά email.
We suspect that Big Pharma is worried that if it turns out the coronavirus is bad, that it could harm their sales of everything else. Yes.
Κυρία Παπαμιχαήλ, τελευταία. Πριν ευχαριστήσουμε τον καθηγητή, να μας πει αν έχει την πληροφορία, αν είναι έγκριτη, ότι από τους υποχρεωτικούς εμβολιασμούς στα κράτη της Αφρικής που οι κυβερνήσεις επέβαλαν, τα τελευταία 2 χρόνια είχαμε 1,5 εκατομμύρια θανάτους και επίσης, αν επιβεβαιώνεται ότι οι ιατρικοί σύλλογοι της Ευρώπης έχουν ζητήσει, κάποιοι έστω, να αρθεί η ασυλία των φαρμακευτικών εταιριών για παρενέργειες από τα εμβόλια.
I am not aware about the African data. So if you have some documentation, I would be grateful to see it. Medical associations have never been at the forefront for creating something better when it comes to the drug companies. So I don't expect medical associations to be helpful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Μια εξαιρετική προσωπικότητα. Τον ευχαριστούμε θερμά που ήταν εδώ σήμερα μαζί μας.
Να πει το όνομα του βιβλίου.
Αυτό κυκλοφορεί εδώ και 4-5 χρόνια. Νομίζω λέγεται φωνικά φάρμακα.
Φωνικά φάρμακα και οργανωμένο έγκλημα.
Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ για όλες αυτές τις χρήσιμες πληροφορίες. Να αποδεσμεύσουμε τον κύριο Gotzsche.